traditional boundary between the Sikkim and Tibet was Nathola. That was a Tibetan claim. And British say, no, it is not Nathola, it is the Chumpi Valley, just on the downside the valley. During the first period, the Avalokiteshvara's manifestations were born in Tibet in the form of as a king. So there were 10 kings. And in the second phase of coming the Buddhism to Tibet, the manifestation or avatar of Avalokiteshvara were born as a scholar and practitioner. So there are 15. There are 15 great scholars and practitioner, among whom the first one is the Dromten Khyabwe Jungne. Dromten Khyabwe Jungne was the disciple of the Dipankar Shri Gyan, who came to Tibet in 11th century. Without Qing dynasty was not incapable of controlling the powerful Mongol populations. So therefore, fifth Dalai Lama was invited by the Qing emperor simply for the reason that he needs his assistant to pacify the Mongol. So 75, I said the present Dalai Lama is the 75th manifestation of Avalokiteshvara. So it is interesting. The first 36 incarnations were born in India as a king in India.
Nabalenge samalola ya samte distillation shuwe yin nga chuchu doji khotang ke zo yin tare nye dong ni se nga dawa chung ye be che chup de resal hakbe ki ning de de lenge samalola ya lagar sa chen shuwe yin tare ke lenge sen ron dang ke le zen di nang nye dong ni se nga ke dawa chung chi be che chup de ki yin cheno khonsa kyam kwe chen po cho ki phe ki lu ni 첩시 기 통계 용수 시대 롱은 주 통화 코비 되든 송제 당대 딜리산의 고든 구디 조주네 구디 슈비 개베 담시 레림 시기능 로드 전부 참바 삼된 라기 tenga pyo tang kya kar nge ki war chö tang rik shung ki denlam chung chung kor song she sur den shu ba shik sham la se se yong wa shu ki tang ani song she di ing ge nang la yin ba yin de zan ne mix ki chi ge yu tu kha la shu bi pham na ba chö ki su su pu du zo la ya an len ji sen ju ba yin na ya bo yong a sam san do chung an de tu la ja ro na chen le shu yin ka ding che.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Professor Jampa Samten. He is Associate Professor teaching the history of Indian Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan history at Central University for Tibetan Studies at Varanasi, India. He is a prolific writer on various issues relating to the subject that he teaches. Over to you, Professor.
Dignitaries on the stage and all the dignitaries here, because today we are gathered here to recollect and to commemorate the 75th year of His Holiness assuming the political and spiritual power. So, therefore, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama legacy is great in terms of spiritual field as well as the politics. We Tibetans believe and treat him like as Avalokiteshvara. So I want His Holiness the present Dalai Lama 14th is 14th in the Dalai Lama incarnation lineage. And as we believe him as the incarnation or manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, the present Dalai Lama is the 75th manifestation of Avalokiteshvara. So this is coincidence. So I wanted to just give a very brief overview of the culture tie between India and Tibet. And then the only contribution I think we Tibetans did for the preservation of ancient Indian culture is through the different incarnation lineage of His Holiness. So 75, I said the present Dalai Lama is the 75th manifestation of our Avalokiteshvara. So it is interesting. The first 36 incarnations were born in India as a king in India. And according to the scripture, the 35th king, Anandashri, was described as the father of Shantirakshita, who came to Tibet in the 8th century, which means he lived in the 8th century. Then the 36th king, Arshadhara, was also described as the father of Dipankar Shirijan, who came to Tibet in the 11th century. So most probably he also lived in the 11th century. So first 36 incarnations or manifestations were born in India, and the remaining were born in Tibet. So this is important. Manifestations born in Tibet as popular kings. According to the Tibetan history, there are 41 kings, and out of which 10 kings are the manifestation of our Avalokiteshvara. And the most important is Tibetan have the greatest repository of ancient Indian knowledge, literature. We have preserved about over 5,000 titles or classical texts of Indian literatures, mainly the Buddhist literatures, from the 7th century until 13th century. So we have the largest number of the Indian translation of the Indian literature, but we have not only preserved the literature, its translation of the literature itself, but we have preserved the traditional, learning and the teaching system which we received from the Indian masters, start from the period 7th century until 13th century. So the ancient Indian literatures and ancient Indian treasures came to Tibet in two phases. The first phase between the period 7th and 9th century. So during this period of time, the ancient Indian treasure or Indian wisdom was brought to Tibet and translated into Tibetan language and nourished and cultured by the Tibetan, mainly 4 kings who are the manifestation of our Avalokiteshvara. Just briefly, I would say, we know that Songtsen Khampo, he was the first Tibetan king who sent Tibetan scholars, Tibetan students to India to learn Buddhism and learn the Indian script and language. Based on the Indian script, the Tibetan script and Tibetan grammar, which is still in use till today, was devised on the Indian script and Indian grammatical system. Since then, we have started translating the Buddhist literature into Tibetan and receiving the Indian master to Tibet. After that, and Teshon Tsen, during the reign of Teshon Tsen, if we don't without the mention of three great Indian scholars, the history of Buddhism in Tibet and the culture contact between India and Tibet in the 8th century would be incomplete. Shantarakshita, Padmasambhava, and Kamalashila. With the coming of these three great Indian scholars, Buddhism was introduced and Buddhism was flourished in India, in Tibet. So two kings. And then the last king is a Tibetan king, is the Tirepachan. With the effort of these kings, who are considered as the manifestations of our Lokateshwar, one of the 75 in the lineage, they have brought the ancient Indian wisdom in Tibet during the 7 to 90 period. So this is one phase. And the second phase of Indian knowledge system which came to Tibet was from the period 11th to 13th century. So during this, during the first period, the Avalokiteshvara's manifestations were born in Tibet in the form of as a king. So there were 10 kings. And in the second phase of coming the Buddhism to Tibet, the manifestation or avatar of Avalokiteshvara were born as a scholar and practitioner. So there are 15. There are 15 great scholars and practitioner, among whom the first one is the Dromten Khyabwe Jone. Dromten Khyabwe Jone was the disciple of the Dipankar Shirijan, who came to Tibet in 11th century. If this great Indian scholar had not been to Tibet in the 11th century, the following then Tibet history of Buddhism in Tibet would be very different. So he was the principal disciple of the Dipankar Shirijana, and he succeeded the teachings of Dipankar Shirijana and from the Kadampa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, and he almost revived the Buddhism in Tibet. He revitalized the translation work in Tibet and practice in Tibet. So, starting from him, there were 15 great Tibetan scholars who are in the lineage of our Avalokiteshvara and in the same lineage of Dalai Lama, who have been responsible, who have been the key person in bringing the Indian knowledge system to Tibet. So and after that, the successive incarnation lineage of Dalai Lama. The first Dalai Lama and second Dalai Lama. First Dalai Lama was a disciple of the Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism. And first and second, these first two incarnations of Dalai Lama, they were the very great scholars, and they flourished the Tsongkhapa's teaching, and especially they wrote commentaries to the Indian philosophical texts written by the Indian scholars. And since then, the study of philosophical study in Tibet has enriched. And then the third Dalai Lama and fourth Dalai Lama's greatest contribution is to disseminate, to propagate the Buddhist teaching and ancient Indian tradition knowledge system outside Tibet, especially to the land of Mongol. In 1578, the third Dalai Lama Sonam Gyatso and the Altan Khan, the descendant of the northern Yon Mongol, had the priest-pattern relationship first, and the Dalai Lama title was given by the Altan Khan to the to the Sonam Gyatso. Since then, the successive incarnations of the Dalai Lama, they continued, they succeeded this title. So the first phase of Buddhism, and particularly Buddhism to flourish in Mongolia during with the effort of third and fourth Dalai Lama. Then the great fifth Dalai Lama, of course you know that fifth Dalai Lama unified the Tibetan political system, and the whole of the Tibet came under the rule of Dalai Lama, and Dalai Lama institution came into existence. During that period of time, Dalai Lama is the only person who can control or who can dictate, who can listen to him. The Mongols, because Qing dynasty Qing dynasty was established in 1644, and Dalai Lama came into power in 1642. So the young Qing dynasty was not incapable of controlling the powerful Mongol populations. So therefore, fifth Dalai Lama was invited by the Qing emperor simply for the reason that he needs his assistant to pacify the Mongol. So fifth Dalai Lama, and then after that, the fifth Dalai Lama institutions continued, and then now the present PRC, they claim the Tibet was an inseparable part from the ancient, I don't know what, so it's just useless. It's spaceless, I think, because today I came from London. We had a 1 week seminar. The seminar was on the issue relating to the Tibetan cultural heritage materials and objects which are preserved in the various museums in the United Kingdom. So there was an issue. Now China is claiming everything, even the air and water, it's all for them. They think that everything on this, even the bird, everything, they think that everything is owned by them. So sometimes they claim the ownership and the provenance of those objects. So I was just invited to tell this actual history, political history of that period, and particularly what was the purpose of young husband coming to Tibet? Related, because many of the articles, objects were brought to United Kingdom during that period of the time. So the thing is very simple. Whether Tibet was under the Chinese rule, what they called the inseparable part of China, or that period of time. Simple thing, we have to learn. Since from 1774, that is from the George Bogle's mission to Tibet, the British India's the principal objective or interest was to establish trade with Tibet, trade in Tibet, trade relation. But unfortunately, Tibetans in those days follow the policy of isolation. They don't want to talk to anybody. They don't listen to anybody. They don't allow any person outside Tibet enter into Tibet. So British, what they did, they signed 4 agreements with China. First, in 1876, what is called Chefu Convention. This is Anglo-Chinese Convention. The main body of the convention is concerning with the Burma, but they included one clause regarding Tibet, that is to give the permission and permission to the British expedition to Tibet, either through India to across the Tibet or either China to across the Tibet. That because Tibetan follow isolation policy. They don't talk, listen, and allow anybody to come in. Outside, even in those days, China is shouting, oh, I am the master of Tibet and I can decide anything regarding Tibet. Then British says, okay, if you can decide anything about Tibet, let us go to Tibet. And this treaty convention was signed. Then in 1885, the British expedition led by Macaulay and his team came to the Tibetan border. Came to the Tibetan border with a small military escort. Tibetans refused to enter him, and the proposed expedition was postponed. Failure. Okay, the China's authority over Tibet was failed. They could not prove it. Then second, again, in 1886, again another Anglo-China convention was signed. That was again the main body of the convention is concerning the Burma, but again one clause concerning Tibet was added. Tibetans got very angry, and then 1888 Tibet, British India border confrontation. There was a border confrontation between the Tibet and British. Then again in 1890, because at that time British wanted two things to be settled. One, they wanted to settle the boundary between the Sikkim and Tibet. Because Tibetans claim Natala, the traditional boundary between the Sikkim and Tibet was Natala. That was a Tibetan claim. And British say, no, it is not Natala, it is the Chumpi Valley, just on the downside the valley. And another interest the British wanted to is to establish arrangement of British trade in Tibet. So they wanted these two things. And they signed one treaty with the Anglo-Chinese Convention in 1890. Then again in 1893, they signed another Anglo-Chinese Convention regarding the arrangement of trade in Tibet. So now here the problem is, did the Tibetans accept it? The terms and conditions of all these four conventions? No, Tibetans flatly refused, and finally, in order to settle the boundary between Sikkim and Tibet, and to make arrangement of British trade in Tibet. These are the two objectives of the young husband's expedition to Tibet, because they could not get it done through Chinese, through those four Anglo-Chinese conventions. So Lord Curzon, finally, he said, the only option to get done is to discuss with the Tibetans directly. But Tibetans were not ready to talk. So therefore, he has to send a military expedition. So therefore, all these things. And finally, the young husband expedition came to Tibet, and they forced the Tibetan to sign the 1904 Anglo-Tibet Convention signed at Lhasa. Through this convention signed between Tibet and Britain, the Britain achieved what they wanted, all those things. The settlement of the border between the Sikkim and Tibet was settled, and arrangement of trade between Tibet and was settled. And since then, the three British Indian and later it was succeeded by the Indian government. 3 trade marches in Tibet is the result of this 1904 consensus. So all this, what it proves? It proves that Chinese has no authority or no influence or no power over Tibetan issues. Tibetans have the sole authority to decide their both domestic and external affair. So this is very clear. So, okay. So with these remarks, and now find the 14th Dalai Lama's greatest contribution or greatest legacy, what I feel is, it was a blessing in disguise in a way that His Holiness and few hundred Tibetan monk scholars escaped out of Tibet in 1959 along with the 80,000 Tibetan refugees. And because of this, the ancient Indian knowledge system, which had been received by the Tibetans since from the 7th century until 13th century, and since then it was nurtured and preserved by the Tibetans, were brought back to their original country. That was, I think, the greatest gift or greatest legacy of His Holiness and the Tibetans. We all came empty-handed, but only this piece of knowledge which we obtained, which we received from India, could finally return to India, and then by the gracious, generous support of the Indian government and the people of India, it flourished in India, and now it is made available throughout the world. As Dalai Lama himself said, a simple Buddhist monk or a Dalai Lama of Tibet now became a symbol of world peace. This is just because of the Indian knowledge system that had enriched him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for those extremely wise words and for reminding us of the